December 17th, 1944. The Ardennes. A German staff officer in the 5th Panzer Army pulls a map case from a destroyed American jeep near the Schnee Eifel. He is looking for intelligence, troop positions, supply routes, anything that will help Hasso von Manteuffel's panzers push west toward the Meuse. He unfolds the map, and then he stops. The map is of Germany, not of France, not of Belgium, of Germany. The Rhineland, the Eifel, the Saar, German soil, drawn by American hands. He holds it up against the light. The contour lines are tight and precise, showing elevation changes he recognizes. The ridgeline south of Prüm, the ravine near Bitburg. The grid overlay is sharp, standardized, mechanical. Roads, he knows, are marked with their correct widths. Bridges are noted with tonnage limits. A rail yard outside Trier has been updated. He can see a siding that was only completed in the autumn of 1943. He turns the map over. There is a printing date. This map was made 3 months ago. In Washington. He has been fighting on this ground for 4 years. His own map, issued by the Heeresplankammer in Berlin, is older, less detailed. Its contour intervals are wider. Its grid system is different from the one used by the division next to his. And the rail siding near Trier is not on it. An American cartographer 5,000 miles away drew a more accurate picture of his country than his own general staff. He does not know the word for what he is looking at. Later, captured German officers will find it. They will call it cheating. If this story already has you thinking about what it took to build maps like that, consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the like button. It helps more people find these stories. Here is what that German officer did not know, and what most people still do not know 80 years later. The map in his hands was not the product of one agency or one genius. It was the final output of a system so large and so strange that it involved dam builders from Tennessee, college women from Ohio who had never held a compass before 1942, a secret intelligence unit that followed the frontline troops into burning cities to steal German survey data, and a warehouse on MacArthur Boulevard outside Washington, where the building itself was covered in camouflage netting, because what happened inside was classified. 500 million maps. That is how many the United States produced during the Second World War. Not 500 million copies of the same map, 500 million individual sheets, covering 40,000 different map designs, spanning 400,000 square miles of the Earth's surface. The Normandy invasion alone required 3,000 different maps, 70 million copies. North Africa, 1,000 maps, 10 million copies. The Pacific, with islands that had not been properly surveyed since the 19th century, required cartographers to work from photographs taken by pilots who were being shot at. And here is the detail that matters most, the detail you should hold on to, because it will come back. Every one of those maps was drawn by hand, every contour line, every road, every bridge symbol, by hand with India ink and contour pens, by people whose average age was 23. But in 1941, almost none of this existed. When the Japanese struck Pearl Harbor, the United States Army had a mapping capability that could charitably be described as negligible. The engineer reproduction plant at Fort McNair, the seed of what would become the Army Map Service, had 18 people. Its archive of foreign maps was a collection of inherited leftovers. For the Pacific, some of the most current charts dated to the 1880s. For Europe, the Army relied on whatever the British were willing to share, which was not always much and was not always current. For North Africa, where American troops would be fighting within 11 months, the Army had almost nothing. The country that would produce 500 million maps in 4 years started with a filing cabinet and a prayer. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary industrial mobilizations of the war, and almost nobody talks about it. Because it did not involve tanks or ships or planes. It involved paper, ink, stereoscopic cameras, and a phone call to a government agency in Chattanooga, Tennessee, that had nothing to do with the military. The Tennessee Valley Authority had been building dams. That was its job: dams, flood control, rural electrification. Franklin Roosevelt's New Deal showpiece. By 1940, the TVA's Maps and Surveys Division had charted 1 million acres of the Tennessee Valley, and in the process had assembled some of the best photogrammetry equipment in the Western Hemisphere. Multiplex projectors, stereoscopic cameras, light tables the size of dining rooms, and people who knew how to use them. 500 cartographers, surveyors, and photo interpreters who had spent a decade turning aerial photographs into topographic maps of a landscape that flooded, shifted, and changed with every season. The Army did not call the TVA because it admired their dam maps. The Army called because it was desperate. In early 1942, American troops were preparing to invade North Africa, and the maps they had were useless. Outdated French colonial surveys, some of them hand-drawn in the 1890s. Artillery officers needed contour data to calculate firing angles. Infantry officers needed to know which roads could carry a truck. Intelligence officers needed to know where the bridges were and how much weight they could hold. Nobody had answers. So the Army shipped crates of aerial photographs, taken by British and American reconnaissance planes over North Africa, France, and eventually Germany itself, to a building in Chattanooga. And the TVA cartographers did something that no other organization in any country could do at that speed. They turned photographs into maps. That sounds simple. It was not. A photograph taken from 20,000 feet is distorted by the curvature of the Earth, by the tilt of the aircraft, by the altitude and the angle of the sun. A hill that rises 300 feet looks flat in a straight-down photograph. A road that curves gently looks kinked. A river that is 40 feet wide looks the same as one that is 400. To turn that photograph into a map that an artillery officer could trust with his life, you had to correct every one of those distortions, mathematically, by hand, using stereoscopic pairs of images viewed through optical equipment that let the cartographer see the terrain in 3 dimensions. The TVA people had been doing exactly this for years. They knew how to read shadows to calculate building heights. They knew how to measure the width of a river from the length of its shadow on a bridge. They knew how to estimate the grade of a road from the spacing of contour lines that they drew, by hand, in India ink, line by patient line. Now imagine this. A reconnaissance pilot over the Rhineland takes 200 photographs at an altitude of 25,000 feet. Those photographs arrive in Chattanooga 4 days later. A woman who had been mapping creek beds in Appalachia 6 months earlier loads the first stereoscopic pair into a multiplex projector. She looks through the eyepiece and sees, in 3 dimensions, a German rail yard outside Koblenz. She can see the individual tracks. She can see which ones are active because the coal dust is darker. She can see a new siding that was not on the previous set of photographs from 3 months ago. She marks it. An editor checks it. A draftsman draws it. A printer runs it. 6 weeks later, that map is in the hands of an American artillery battalion preparing to cross the Rhine. The Fire Direction Center uses the grid coordinates on that map to calculate a firing solution. And when 144 shells from 3 batteries land on that rail yard simultaneously, the German defenders cannot understand how the Americans knew the siding was there. It is not on any map they have ever seen. That is what cheating looked like. But the TVA was only one piece. 500 people in Chattanooga, working nearly 1.5 million hours over the course of the war, could not produce 500 million maps alone. They handled the most technically demanding work, the photogrammetric conversion of aerial photographs into precision topographic maps. The sheer volume of drafting, editing, printing, and distribution required something else entirely. And this is where the story takes a turn that almost no one expects. Because the people who actually drew most of America's war maps, the people whose hands held the contour pens and whose eyes checked every grid line, were not soldiers. They were not engineers. They were not even, for the most part, trained cartographers. They were college girls from the Midwest. And in 1942, most of them had never seen a topographic map. In the autumn of 1942, a geography professor named Edith Putnam Parker stood in front of a classroom at the University of Chicago and made an unusual pitch. She was not recruiting students for a graduate program. She was recruiting them for war. Parker had designed a 60-hour course in military cartography, not for engineers, not for surveyors, but for undergraduate women at colleges across the East and Midwest. The course would teach them how to read aerial photographs, how to draw contour lines, how to translate the language of terrain into the language of ink on paper. Upon completion, they would be eligible for civil service positions at the Army Map Service in Washington. The pay was reasonable. The hours were not. At Kent State University in Ohio, a senior named B. Shaheen sat in on one of these sessions. The instructor was Edna Eisen, a geography professor who had a gift for making the abstract feel urgent. Eisen told her students that the men who had been drawing maps for the Army were now carrying rifles. Somebody had to replace them, and the maps they needed to draw were not classroom exercises. They were documents that would determine whether artillery shells hit a German gun battery or a French farmhouse with children inside. B. Shaheen graduated in March of 1943 and reported to Washington. She was 22 years old. She had never held a contour pen. The building where she worked was a 3-story brick structure on MacArthur Boulevard in Montgomery County, Maryland, called the Ruth Building. From the outside, you could not tell what it was. The roof and walls were covered in camouflage netting. Armed guards checked identification at every entrance. Inside, rows of women sat at light tables, glass surfaces illuminated from below, hunched over sheets of translucent paper, drawing. They called themselves the Military Mapping Maidens. The Army magazine that coined the nickname shortened it to the 3 M's. There were 224 of them at peak strength, recruited from 22 colleges and universities. They commuted by trolley. They lived in civil service housing at McLean Gardens. On weekends, some of them went canoeing on the Potomac. On weekdays, they worked 7 days out of 7, 10 hours a day, sometimes more. 70-hour weeks were standard when a deadline approached. And the deadlines were not set by supervisors. They were set by invasions. Here is what a 70-hour week looked like. A stack of aerial photographs arrives from the European theater. Images of a stretch of French coastline taken by a P-38 flying at 300 miles per hour with no guns, only cameras. The photographs are referenced against whatever existing maps are available. Sometimes a French survey from 1912, sometimes a British Ordnance Survey sheet, sometimes nothing at all. The cartographer loads a stereoscopic pair into the viewer and begins to trace what she sees. Roads, hedgerows, the outlines of buildings, the shape of a beach, the position of what might be a seawall, or might be a shadow. She draws with India ink, which does not smudge and does not forgive. A mistake means starting the section over. She uses a contour pen for elevation lines, thin, precise curves that tell an artillery officer whether the ground rises or falls, and by how much. She cross-checks every feature against the photographs, against the reference maps, against the notes left by the photo interpreters. Accuracy is not a preference. A contour line drawn 10 meters too far south means a shell lands on the wrong side of a ridge. A bridge symbol placed 50 meters upstream means a tank column drives into a river. 600 hours of labor for each new map. That is what it took, and these women produced more than 40,000 of them. Remember that number, 600 hours, because it explains something that German officers could not understand when they captured those maps. The maps did not look mass-produced. They looked like someone had cared about every line. Someone had. A 22-year-old woman in Maryland, drawing for 10 hours straight, knowing that the map under her hands would be in a lieutenant's pocket on a beach she had never seen, in a country she might never visit, within weeks of the moment she lifted her pen. By 1945, women made up 58% of the Army Map Service. But here is what even the mapping maidens could not solve. You can draw a perfect map of a piece of ground from an aerial photograph. You can mark every road, every building, every contour. But for that map to work for artillery, for shells to land where the grid coordinates say they should land, you need something the photograph cannot give you. You need to know exactly where you are on the surface of the Earth. Not approximately. Exactly. To the meter. That requires geodetic data, precise survey measurements that tie the map's grid to the physical shape of the planet. And in 1944, as the Allies pushed into Germany, they discovered something that no one had anticipated. The geodetic data they needed to make their maps work on German soil did not exist in Allied hands. The Germans had it, and they were hiding it. Finding it became the mission of a man with red hair and wire-rimmed glasses, a Cornell degree, and a set of orders so secret that one of his team members was told not to open his envelope until 2 hours after his plane left the ground. October 23, 1944, Paris. Major Floyd W. Huff stepped off a military transport and into a city that still smelled like liberation. Diesel, wet stone, and the faint sweetness of bread baking for the first time in 4 years without German requisition quotas. He was 46 years old, short, serious, with receding red hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look more like a small-town librarian than what he was, the leader of one of the most unusual intelligence units of the entire war. Huff Team. 19 people. 3 officers, 4 civilian consultants, 10 enlisted men, and later, 2 women. No table of organization, no attachment to any army group, no fixed chain of command. What they had were blue passes, special credentials issued by Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force that allowed them to go anywhere in the combat zone, at any time, without asking permission from anyone below Eisenhower's staff. And they carried something else. 1,800 pounds of cameras and microfilm equipment, and 11,000 index cards. Think about that for a moment. 11,000 index cards, each one listing a specific target, a university library, a government archive, a geodetic survey office, a private institute, along with what the Army Map Service believed that target contained. Some cards listed names of German scientists. Next to certain names was a notation, likely to cooperate. Next to others, not to be trusted. Howe Team was not looking for weapons. They were not looking for uranium or rocket parts or code machines. They were looking for numbers, triangulation points, benchmark elevations, gravity measurements, the raw mathematical skeleton of the European continent, without which no map could tell an artilleryman exactly where his shells would land. Here is the problem they were solving, and it is worth understanding because it explains everything that comes after. When an American artillery battery fires at a target it cannot see, and by 1944, that was how nearly all artillery was used, the Fire Direction Center calculates a solution: azimuth, elevation, powder charge. That calculation depends on knowing 2 things with extreme precision: where the guns are and where the target is. Both positions are defined by coordinates on a map. But those coordinates are only meaningful if the map's grid is anchored to the real shape of the Earth. Not the idealized sphere from a geometry textbook, but the actual, lumpy, irregular geoid, which bulges at the equator and flattens at the poles, and varies by dozens of meters from one region to another. The science of measuring that real shape is called geodesy, and every country that had done serious geodetic work kept its data secret, because geodetic data is, in the most literal sense, a targeting system. If you have precise geodetic control of a piece of terrain, your artillery hits what it aims at. If you do not, your shells drift. 50 meters, 100, enough to miss a bridge, enough to hit a hospital. The Americans had superb geodetic coverage of their own continent. They had good coverage of Britain thanks to the British Ordnance Survey. They had workable coverage of France and North Africa, pieced together from French colonial surveys. But of Germany, the country they were about to invade, they had almost nothing. The Germans, naturally, had surveyed their own territory with extraordinary precision. Generations of Prussian geodesists had built a triangulation network across Central Europe that was among the finest in the world. But that data sat in archives in Berlin, in university libraries, in regional survey offices, behind the lines. If the Americans wanted their maps of Germany to work for artillery, they needed that data. And they needed it before the guns crossed the Rhine. That was Hough's job. Follow the front. Enter cities while they were still burning. Find the data before the Germans could destroy it or the Soviets could take it. Microfilm everything. And get it to the artillery as fast as physically possible. The weather in Paris was miserable that autumn. Electricity came and went. The enlisted men burned whatever wood they could find. Hough's team spent weeks doing library research in France, Belgium, and neutral countries, nibbling at the edges of the real mission. One of the civilian consultants, a linguist named Berthold Friedel, who spoke 5 languages and struggled to make small talk with the enlisted men, passed the time by writing a book about Soviet military strategy. In French. Raymond Johnson, a 24-year-old telephone lineman from Chicago, explored the cabarets and practiced his French with local women. They were waiting for the front to move. Then came December, and the Ardennes, and the German counteroffensive that froze everything in place for 6 weeks. Hough's team sat in Paris while the Battle of the Bulge raged to the east. It was during those weeks, while Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army drove toward the Meuse, that captured German officers began telling American interrogators something strange. They said the American maps they had found were better than their own. Not just better printed, better informed, more current, more detailed, of German territory. The interrogators filed the reports. The reports reached intelligence staffs, and the intelligence staffs already knew why. The system that produced those maps, the TVA cartographers, the mapping maidens, the photogrammetric pipeline that turned aerial photographs into precision topographic sheets, was working. What it lacked was the final piece, the geodetic backbone that would make those beautiful, hand-drawn maps accurate enough to kill with. Hough was about to find it. But first, the front had to move. And in early March of 1945, it did. Aachen had fallen 5 months earlier, October 21st, 1944, the first German city captured by the Americans. The fighting had been savage, house to house, room to room, until the rubble was so thick that tanks could not navigate the streets. When Hough and 2 of his men arrived in early November, the city was still smoldering. "The city appears to be 98% destroyed," he wrote in a memo to Washington. His target was not a military installation. It was a library. The Technische Hochschule, Aachen's technical university, had been nearly wrecked by American bombs. More than 70% of its buildings were damaged or destroyed. But thousands of books remained in the wreckage. And outside the library, stacked in bundles as if someone had prepared to load them onto trucks and then run out of time, Hough found something better than books. Folders. Roped together, covered in dust and plaster. Inside were tables of triangulation data, precise survey measurements covering German territory that the Allies had not yet reached. Cities, rivers, rail junctions, road intersections, each one pinpointed to the meter, tied into the German National Geodetic Network. This was not intelligence in the usual sense. It was the mathematical foundation of accurate artillery fire. Hough's team microfilmed everything in hours. The film was sent directly to the front, not to Washington, not through channels, directly to the survey officers of the advancing American armies. who fed the numbers into their fire direction centers. According to a later account published in Life magazine, what happened next was immediate. American gunners who had been compensating for map errors, adjusting fire based on where the shells actually landed rather than where the maps said they should land, suddenly found that their first rounds were hitting the target. The magazine described it plainly. The gunner's aim improved immediately. And Huff was already moving. Because the data from Aachen covered only a fraction of Germany, the deeper the armies pushed, the more geodetic data they would need. And the Germans knew what they had. They were not going to leave it sitting in libraries. By March of 1945, the Allied armies had crossed the Rhine. Huff entered Frankfurt the day after it fell, March 30th. Buildings were still burning. Water was so scarce that his team drank from 2 bathtubs the Germans had not drained before fleeing. The target institutions in Frankfurt had been reduced to ash. In the basement of one building, Huff saw what looked like books. When he touched them, they crumbled into powder. Whatever had been there was gone. But in Wiesbaden, a few miles to the west, the team's luck turned. In a basement, behind a pile of deliberately placed rubbish, they found 18 bundles of survey data, marked Geheim and Vertraulich, secret and confidential, covering thousands of precise survey points across southwestern Germany. Huff recognized what he was looking at. This was the kind of data that could save hundreds of American lives in the weeks to come, because every survey point that entered the fire direction system meant one less battery firing blind. The data was microfilmed and rushed to the survey officers of the 3rd and 7th Armies in time for the push into Bavaria. And then came a tip. One of Huff Team's Ritchie boys, Hans Jakob Meyer, a gregarious immigrant in his late 30s who ran a delicatessen in New York City and had a talent for making people talk, was interrogating a captured officer from the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, the German National Survey Agency. The officer mentioned 2 small towns in Thuringia, about 140 miles to the east. Towns that were not on any of Huff's target lists. Towns with names that meant nothing to the intelligence staffs. Friedrichroda, Waltershausen. The officer said the towns were small, unremarkable, known mainly for artisanal dolls made from unglazed porcelain. He said this almost as an afterthought, the way a man mentions something he assumes does not matter. Meyer pressed. The officer said more, and what he said changed the trajectory of Huff's entire mission. He said that the archive of the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, the most comprehensive geodetic and cartographic repository in Germany, representing the government's best survey data of its own territory, had been evacuated from Berlin. It had been dispersed and hidden in doll factories, in private homes, in a ranch house, in a stable, everything. The entire archive, hidden in 2 villages in the Thuringian hills. Huff left for Thuringia on April 10th with 4 enlisted men. The 3rd Army's 87th Infantry Division had just passed through the area and was still pushing east. The roads were littered with abandoned German equipment. The front was fluid, confused, and moving fast. But there was a problem that Huff understood better than anyone on his team. Thuringia was in the zone that had been agreed upon at Yalta. When the fighting stopped, this territory would be handed to the Soviet Union. Whatever Huff found, he would have to take it out before the Soviets arrived. And what he found, in those 2 quiet villages in the hills, was beyond anything he had been prepared for. In Friedrichroda and Waltershausen, Huff's team moved from building to building. 3 doll factories, several private homes, a ranch house, a stable. In each one, they found the same thing. Crates and bundles and filing cabinets, stacked floor to ceiling, that had been trucked out of Berlin ahead of the bombing and hidden among porcelain molds and straw. It was the entire archive of the Reichsamt für Landesaufnahme, the German government's best survey data of its own territory. Triangulation tables, benchmark elevations, gravity measurements, photogrammetric plates, decades of precision geodetic work compiled by generations of Prussian and German surveyors going back to the 19th century. the mathematical skeleton of Central Europe. Huff knew what he had. He also knew what was coming. Soviet forces were advancing from the east. The Yalta Agreement meant this territory would change hands. Every day mattered. But the story was not over. Because 1 week later, Huff's team entered the town of Saalfeld, April 17, 1945. The 87th Infantry Division had captured Saalfeld just days earlier and kept moving. Huff arrived to find a town that had barely been touched by the war. Medieval rooftops, cobblestone streets, the Saale River running clean beneath stone bridges. It looked like a painting. It did not look like the place where the German army had hidden its most important secret. But the tip Meyer had extracted during interrogation pointed here. And when Huff's team found the warehouse, they understood why captured German officers had been so reluctant to talk. Inside was a room 30 feet by 50 feet, stacked floor to ceiling with documents, instruments, and maps. Not just the civilian archive from Friedrichroda. This was the military collection, the geodetic archives of the German army itself. Captured survey data from every country Germany had occupied: France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Poland, the Balkans, and something else. Something that made Huff's hands shake when he realized what he was looking at. Russian geodetic data. Precise survey measurements covering the Western Soviet Union, territory that no American surveyor had ever set foot on, that no Allied reconnaissance plane had ever photographed. The Germans had captured it during their advance into Russia and brought it back to Berlin. Now it was sitting in a warehouse in Thuringia, and the Soviets did not know the Americans had found it. The total haul was staggering. 90 tons of geodetic materials. Maps covering all of Europe, Asiatic Russia, parts of North Africa. High-precision instruments, stereoplanographs worth millions in today's money. Equipment that could turn aerial photographs into topographic maps with an accuracy that most countries could not match. Survey records that represented centuries of cumulative scientific work. And all of it was in the Soviet zone. Huff did not wait for orders. He commandeered trucks from nearby army units. He enlisted German civilians to load them. He borrowed planes. He worked around the clock, packing 1,200 boxes in a matter of days. 35 2.5-ton trucks rolled west, out of Thuringia, carrying what one historian later called the single largest seizure of scientific intelligence in the European theater. By the time Germany surrendered on May 8th, every box was in Allied-controlled territory. Now step back and see what had been built. Not one piece of a system, the whole system, running together. The TVA cartographers in Chattanooga turning aerial photographs into three-dimensional terrain models. The mapping maidens in Maryland, drawing every contour line by hand. 600 hours per map, 70 hours a week. Their India ink tracing roads and bridges that soldiers would cross within months. The Army Map Service, printing millions of copies and shipping them across the Atlantic in waterproof cases. The reconnaissance pilots, flying unarmed over enemy territory to bring back the photographs. And now Huff, on the ground in Germany, stealing the geodetic backbone that tied the whole system together. The data that made the grid coordinates on those hand-drawn maps accurate enough to drop a shell into a specific window of a specific building in a specific town. Each piece was impressive on its own. Together, they were something no other nation had ever assembled. Not Germany, not Britain, not the Soviet Union. A cartographic pipeline that stretched from an unarmed P-38 over the Rhineland to a light table in Tennessee, to a drafting room in Maryland, to a printing press in Washington, to a waterproof case on a transport ship, to a lieutenant's pocket in a foxhole. And every link in that chain worked. That was what the German officers found when they unfolded a captured American map. Not a single act of brilliance, a system. And the system was so far beyond anything they had built that the only word they could find was cheating. But there is one more piece of this story. One more thing the Germans did not know. And it begins not with a map, but with a man. a German general who had spent the entire war building Germany's own cartographic machine, and who, after the surrender, was found in the last place anyone expected. Gerlach Himmerich had been a career officer, a military geodesist. In 1936, he was appointed head of the 9th Department of the Army General Staff, responsible for all military mapping, surveying, and geographical analysis in the German armed forces. He started with 2 officers and 20 civilians. By the time he was finished, he had built a cartographic machine that covered Europe from the Atlantic to the Urals. The Heeresplankammer, the Army Planning Chamber, was his creation. Under Himmerich's command, German military cartography expanded from reprinting old maps to producing new ones, updated with aerial photography, standardized with military grids, printed in the millions. His surveyors followed the Wehrmacht into Poland, France, the Low Countries, the Balkans, the Soviet Union. Wherever the army went, Himmerich's men seized the local mapping agencies, captured their data, and integrated it into the German system. He built a geodetic network that spanned a continent, and it was not enough. That is the fact that the German officers were really confronting when they unfolded those American maps and called it cheating. They were not simply admiring the print quality or the contour detail. They were staring at evidence that their system, the system that Himmerich had built over nearly a decade, staffed with trained professionals, backed by the resources of the German state, had been outproduced, outpaced, and finally outmatched by a country that had started the war with 18 people in a warehouse at Fort McNair. Consider what Himmerich was working with. Professional surveyors, military cartographers with years of formal training, the finest geodetic instruments that German optics could produce, a mapping tradition that stretched back to the Prussian General Staff of the 1850s. And a head start. Germany had been preparing its military maps since 1936, 3 years before the war began. Now consider what the Americans were working with. College girls with 60 hours of classroom instruction, dam builders from Tennessee, a Cornell engineer leading a team of 19 people with blue passes and a crate of index cards, a camouflage building in Maryland where the workers commuted by trolley and went canoeing on weekends. And the Americans won. They did not just match the Germans, they surpassed them, on German soil, using German data that they had captured, German aerial photographs that they had reprocessed, and a production system so efficient that a map drafted in Maryland could be in a lieutenant's hands in France within 6 weeks of the photograph being taken. How? The answer is not talent. The Germans had talent. It is not resources. By 1944, the Americans had more of everything, but resources alone do not explain the speed. The answer is something that shows up again and again across every American advantage in the Second World War, from artillery to logistics to manufacturing. The Americans built systems that did not depend on individual expertise. They built systems that turned ordinary people into specialists in weeks, and then connected those specialists into a pipeline where each person's narrow skill fed the next person's narrow skill, and the final product was something that no single person in the chain could have created alone. Himmerich's system depended on trained professionals doing complex work. It was deep, and it was excellent, and it could not scale. When his surveyors were killed or captured, replacing them took years. When his printing facilities were bombed, production stopped. When the Wehrmacht retreated, his field units lost access to the territory they needed to survey. The American system depended on a 22-year-old from Ohio who had learned to hold a contour pen 12 weeks ago, but who was connected to a reconnaissance pilot, a photo interpreter in Chattanooga, a geodesist in the field, a printing press running 3 shifts, and a supply chain that delivered waterproof map cases to the front by the ton. Remove any single person, and the system continued. Train a replacement in weeks, not years. Bomb a printing facility, and another one picks up the run. It was not cheating. It was the difference between a craft and an industry. And Himmerich himself seemed to understand this in the end. After the surrender, the general who had commanded Germany's entire military mapping enterprise did not attempt to bargain with the Allies, did not try to trade his expertise for favorable treatment. He disappeared. He took a job stoking furnaces at a United States Army installation in Berlin, shoveling coal alongside laborers who had no idea that the quiet man feeding the boiler had once directed the work of thousands of cartographers across a continent. He might have remained there indefinitely, if not for an American intelligence officer named Schallenberger. The Army had commandeered Hemmerich's home. On a hunch, Schallenberger paid a visit. The woman who answered the door introduced herself as the cook. She was polite, she was composed, and she spoke German in the formal register, the kind of language used by the highly educated, not by household staff. Schallenberger asked questions. The woman eventually admitted that she was Hemmerich's wife, that her husband had been living in the house the entire time the Americans occupied it, that he came home from his furnace-stoking job every evening and slept under the same roof as the officers who were searching for him. When Hemmerich returned from work that evening, Schallenberger and an armed escort were waiting. The general who had built Germany's cartographic machine was taken into custody, carrying soot on his hands and wearing a laborer's coat. The man whose maps had guided Manteuffel's panzers through the Ardennes was now a prisoner of the country whose maps had been better than his own. He never said the word cheating, but the officers who served under him did. And what they meant, whether they knew it or not, was something simpler and more devastating than any complaint about unfairness. They meant, we did not lose because their maps were better. We lost because they had a way of making everything better, faster, than we could make anything at all. In September of 1945, Floyd Huff returned to Washington. He resumed his old position as head of the Geodetic Division at the Army Map Service, as if the previous 11 months had been a business trip that ran long. The 90 tons of data his team had pulled out of Thuringia became the foundation of something far larger than anyone had anticipated during the war. American geodesists spent the next 6 years connecting the German triangulation network to the British, French, and Scandinavian systems. The result, completed in 1951, was the European Datum 1950, the first unified geodetic framework covering all of Western Europe. It remained the standard for half a century. Every NATO map, every Cold War targeting calculation, every satellite positioning system that followed, built upon the numbers that Huff's team had loaded into 1,200 boxes while Soviet forces advanced from the east. Hans Jacob Meyer, the delicatessen owner from New York, who had coaxed the location of the Saalfeld archive out of a reluctant German officer, was recommended for a Bronze Star. Huff credited him with uncovering intelligence that led directly to many of the team's most important discoveries. After the war, Meyer returned to New York. The deli, presumably, carried on. Raymond Johnson, the 24-year-old telephone lineman from Chicago who had explored the cabarets of Paris during those long months of waiting, went home and wrote an unpublished memoir. His daughters kept it. In it, he described the evening his team was billeted in a German home near Saalfeld. The house was charming and comfortable. Plants in the windows, children's toys in the bedrooms, china in the cabinets. One of his men sat in an armchair, silently burning holes in the upholstery with a cigarette. They had visited Ohrdruf, a subcamp of Buchenwald, the week before. There was nothing we could do, Johnson wrote, that could measure up to the enormity of what we had seen. B. McPherson, B. Shaheen, when she walked into that Kent State classroom in 1942, stayed with the government after the war. Many of the mapping maidens did. They had been told their jobs were temporary, that the men would come back and reclaim the light tables. Some men came back, but the women had drawn 40,000 maps in 3 years, and the agencies that employed them understood something that the general public did not yet grasp. These women were not placeholders. They were professionals. In 2016, at the age of 95, McPherson stood in the headquarters of the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, the distant descendant of the Army Map Service, and accepted a plaque on behalf of all the military mapping maidens. They had been inducted into the Geospatial Intelligence Hall of Fame. In her speech, she said, Our country was at the forefront of our minds. We believed in our country. We protected our country, and we wanted to do our part, our very best, our patriotic duty. She received a standing ovation. And somewhere in the archives of a dozen American intelligence agencies, in filing cabinets and databases and climate-controlled vaults, the maps are still there, hand-drawn, India ink on translucent paper, contour lines traced by women who had learned to hold the pen 12 weeks before they drew their first line. Grid coordinates anchored by data that a man with red hair and wire-rimmed glasses stole from doll factories in Thuringia while the world was ending around him. Printed by the hundreds of millions, shipped across an ocean, carried into battle in waterproof cases, unfolded in foxholes and command posts and burning buildings by men who never knew, who could not have known, the name of the person whose hand had drawn the road they were following, or the bridge they were crossing, or the ridge where they would fight and sometimes die. The German officers who captured those maps and called it cheating were wrong about the word. But they were right about the feeling. They had looked at a piece of paper and seen something that could not be explained by any single advantage. Not technology, not money, not manpower. What they saw was the output of a nation that had learned, in the space of 3 years, to turn school teachers into cartographers, dam builders into military surveyors, a delicatessen owner into an interrogator, and a filing cabinet at Fort McNair into 500 million maps. It was not cheating. It was America solving a problem the way it solved every problem in that war, by building a system so large and so fast that by the time the enemy understood what was happening, the maps were already in the lieutenant's pocket, the grid coordinates were already in the fire direction center, and the shells were already in the air. Thank you for watching this all the way through. It truly means a lot. If this story surprised you, or if it taught you something you did not know, a like makes a real difference. It tells the algorithm that this kind of deep history is worth showing to more people, and that is how stories like the Mapping Maidens and Ho Team find the audience they deserve. If you're not subscribed yet, now is a good time, and the bell icon makes sure that you do not miss the next one. I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where are you watching from today? And if someone in your family served in the Second World War, whether they carried a rifle, flew a plane, or drew a map at a light table in Maryland, I would be honored if you shared their story below. These videos exist because of them.